concept of black English has been a subject of discussion among a few academicians, especially linguists, since the early 1900s. However, it was not until the past decade that scholars began to write, research, and establish the legitimacy of its existence. Black English, loosely defined, is a language peculiar to the verbal communications of many black Americans. In recent years, much controversy has stemmed from proponents who advocate its recognition and from conservatives who are dubious of its implications and consequences. Opponents of the concept of black English include such blacks as Benjamin Hooks, the executive head of the NAACP, and Carl Rowan, a noted syndicated columnist. Numerous white educators have expressed reservations as to the formalization of this concept. However, in recent controversial rulings, federal courts have upheld black English as a separate dialect in Michigan and in Florida. At a seminar sponsored in Washington, D.C. by the National Institute of Education, many language experts praised the ruling, believing that it might have the effect of reviving research in this field that they began in the 1960s but never finished because of a turn in public sentiment. Much of the controversy has grown out of a misinterpretation of the court's rulings and out of ignorance of linguistic realities. In an attempt to clarify the issue, Professor Geneva Smitherman of Wayne State University, who testified in one of the cases, explained that the court did not rule that black English must be taught, but that the ruling ordered that teachers be sensitized to the language and understand its historical value so that they can better teach black students standard English, perhaps as a second language. Black English, like any other language pattern, must closely be viewed with the cultural history of the group who speaks the language. The purpose of this forum is to discuss the issues and the origin of the particular linguistic pattern known as black English. Respondents to Professor Smith are Dr. May Shee, a professor and linguist in the Department of English, Mr. James Randall, a graduate student in the Department of English, Dr. Felix Barton, a professor in the Black Studies program and is from Western Africa, Dr. Henry Wilson, a professor in the Black Studies program, Dr. Jeffrey Gamble, a professor and linguist in the Department of Anthropology, and Dr. Mark Fleischer, a professor and a cultural anthropologist in the Department of Anthropology. Professor Smith, will you start this discussion by giving us a brief synopsis of the concept of black English and a statement on the origin of this linguistic pattern among many black Americans?
To risk of creating even more confusion, let me first begin by introducing another term, and that term is the word Ebonics. The word Ebonics is a compound of two words, ebony, which means black, and phonics, which means sounds. Now, in 1973, at a psycholinguistics conference convened under a grant from the National Institute of Mental Health, a professor by the name of Robert Williams, a psychologist at Washington University, invited a number of scholars in the fields of linguistics, anthropology, sociology, psychology, speech pathology, and audiology to discuss some controversy that was emerging in the literature over the use of that term, black English, because it became quite apparent to a lot of the African American scholars who were doing research in that area that the term black English was being used with totally different meanings. And let me explain what the argument was. The term black English was viewed by the African American linguists as an anomalous statement. An anomalous statement is a statement that contradicts itself. If you say, my sister is an only child, how can she be my sister if she's an only child? Or that bachelor is married. He can't be a bachelor if he's in fact married. when you look at the term black English, this is what you find. You find people calling the language of slave descendants of African origin black English. But when you look at the literature that they disseminate about this language, it does not in any way correspond, except in lexical items, to the structural that I know to be the English language. So we question the legitimacy of the use of the term black English, and instead we pose the term Ebonics, black sounds. We can argue whether or not the patterning of these sounds corresponds more to the English language, or we can debate whether or not they correspond more to the African, Niger-Congo, or Hamitu-Bantu languages. But no one can question that most human languages are spoken by the use of pulmonic egressive air streams. This is lung air that is egressing. Now, when a linguist goes into a speech community, he does not prescribe how a language ought to be spoken or written. He is merely there to make observations and attempt to make a scientific statement. He is attempting to describe how the language is spoken or written. When the African-American scholars began to look at the language of slave descendants of African origin, we began to find patterns that do not correspond to what is known to be the English language. We find patterns that at the base of the historical process can be traced to the African, Niger-Congo, or Hamitu-Bantu languages from which they originated. Now, so we look at the term black English and we question that term first as an anomalous statement. It contradicts what they are actually disseminating to be English. The other argument had to do with the term black English in terms of it being a contradiction that no other limited English-speaking population has an adjective of color before their variety of English. I mean, there are limited English Asians, and you don't find the label yellow English before their variety of English. You notice Hispanic Americans who are limited English speaking, who take the same instruments and come up limited or non-English speaking. You don't find the label brown English before these limited English speakers. Native Americans who are limited English speakers are not called, don't have their limited English proficiency label red English, and even the non-standard speaking Anglos, the white trash. I never find any literature discussing the deviant variety of English spoken by the poor Appalachian or Southern whites as white trash English. So we look at the term black English in that respect. The word black has always represented to the European something evil, base, licentious, wanton, depraved, corrupt. And when the Europeans who refer to black language as a black English, they're not talking about the language of Bryant Gumbel or Max Robinson or Ed Bradley or Jane Kennedy. They're not talking about the English of these blacks who happen to be professional speakers of English. They're talking about